September 2021, Vermilion Parish, Louisiana, had already taken nearly everything Mara Bell's farm could afford to lose. 3 days of tropical rain had turned the lower pasture into a sheet of brown water. The hay shed stood in ankle-deep mud. A section of fence had disappeared beneath the flood. The bank payment was due in 12 days, and Mara had exactly enough money left to buy feed for another week. At 19, she had learned not to count what she didn't have. She counted what remained. 27 cattle. 1 old Ford 8N. 3 healthy pecan trees she refused to cut down. And 1 enormous albino buffalo. The buffalo stood calmly in the rising water. His white coat was streaked with mud, but he was strong, alert, and steady on his feet. His ears turned toward every sound. His broad head remained above the water as he watched the flooded pasture. Mara held the rope attached to his halter. "Come on, Ghost." He didn't move. Mara tugged gently. The buffalo looked at her. Then he looked toward the eastern field. Mara followed his gaze. Nothing. Only rain. Only flooded grass. Only the dark line of pecan trees beyond the pasture. She pulled the rope again. Ghost took 1 step. Then stopped. Mara sighed. "You picked today to become stubborn?" The buffalo lowered his head. He wasn't frightened. That was what bothered her. Every other animal on the farm had been moved toward higher ground. The cattle crowded beneath the barn's raised roof. Chickens perched along the highest fence rail. Even the old farm dog refused to leave the porch. But Ghost seemed fascinated by the flood. Mara stepped closer. Something was moving beneath the water. Not an animal. The surface trembled in a small circle about 10 feet away. Then another circle appeared. Mara stood still. Tiny bubbles rose through the muddy water. 1, 2, 5. She looked at Ghost. His ears pointed directly toward them. Mara slowly released the rope. The buffalo didn't run. He simply watched. A truck appeared beyond the fence. Claire Whitmore climbed out. At 35, Claire was one of the younger agricultural consultants working in the parish. She wore a yellow raincoat over field clothes and carried a waterproof folder beneath one arm. She had visited Mara's farm twice that year. Both times, she had told Mara the same thing. The property needed modern drainage. The old methods were inefficient. The farm couldn't survive on instinct. Claire walked toward the fence. "Mara." Mara waved. Claire stopped when she saw the buffalo standing in the flooded pasture. "Is he okay?" "He's fine." "Then why haven't you moved him?" "I tried." Claire looked at Ghost. The buffalo looked back. "He doesn't seem very interested in leaving. He keeps stopping." Claire stepped through the gate. "Mara, the water is still rising." "I know. You need to get everything above the eastern line." Mara looked toward the field. "The high ground is already occupied." Claire glanced at the buffalo. "Then move him toward the barn." Mara started pulling the rope again. Ghost took 2 steps. Stopped. Then turned his head toward the bubbling water. Claire noticed. "What is he looking at?" "I don't know." The 2 women stood quietly. Another bubble rose. Then another. Claire crouched near the water's edge. "That's strange." Mara joined her. The water was almost still. But beneath it, something was moving through the soil. Claire reached toward the surface. Mara stopped her. "Don't." Claire looked up. "Why?" "My grandfather used to say the ground around here can fool you." Claire stood. "Your grandfather also refused to replace that drainage system." "He had reasons. He had habits." Mara didn't answer. She had heard that argument before. Her grandfather had farmed this land for 42 years. He repaired machines other farmers threw away. He planted trees other people considered useless. He kept old drainage channels open even after modern engineers told him they were unnecessary. 3 years earlier, when Mara inherited the farm, she thought those habits were simply stubbornness. Now she wasn't so sure. Ghost suddenly took 3 steps toward the bubbling water. Mara followed. Claire watched. The buffalo stopped directly over a shallow depression beneath the flood. Then he pawed the mud once. Water clouded around his hoof. He pawed again. Something small moved beneath the surface. Mara leaned closer. A tiny dark shell emerged from the mud. Claire stared. "What is that?" Mara didn't answer. The creature disappeared. Then another appeared 10 feet away. Then another. Mara walked toward the second one. A small crab crawled from beneath the flooded grass. Claire slowly stood. "That's a crab." "I know. There shouldn't be crabs here." Mara looked toward the distant marsh. "The coast isn't that far." "Far enough." Another crab emerged. Then 3 more. Then a dozen. They weren't coming from the surface. They were coming from underneath the pasture. Mara looked across the field. Small patches of mud were beginning to move. Hundreds of tiny bubbles rose through the floodwater. Ghost remained completely calm. He lifted his head. Then he turned east. Mara followed his gaze. Beyond the pecan grove stood an abandoned rice field her grandfather hadn't used in decades. She remembered something. A sentence. One he had repeated whenever she asked why the eastern pasture was never plowed. "Some ground has a job you can't see." At the time, she had laughed. Now she couldn't. Claire walked beside her. What did he mean? Mara looked at the buffalo. "I don't know." Ghost started walking. Not toward the barn. Not toward the high ground. Toward the old pecan trees. Mara tightened her grip on the rope and followed. The crabs moved with him. One by one, they emerged from the flooded earth. Then Mara noticed something that made her stop. The crabs weren't spreading randomly. They were following a line. A narrow line beneath the water. A line that led directly toward the abandoned rice field. Claire saw it too. "That looks like a channel." Mara stared at the submerged ground. Her grandfather's old drainage map was somewhere inside the farmhouse. She suddenly wanted to see it. Ghost kept walking. Then, beside the oldest pecan tree, he stopped again. He lowered his head. The water around his hooves began to ripple. Mara looked down. The ground beneath the flood was moving. And this time, she could hear it. A faint rushing sound. Coming from underneath the farm. The rushing sound disappeared as quickly as it had come. Mara remained beside the pecan tree, staring at the water. Ghost stood quietly beside her. His ears moved once. Then again. He was listening. Claire stepped closer. "You heard that too?" Mara nodded. The water around the buffalo's hooves was slowly clearing. Beneath the brown surface, she could see dark soil. And something else. A narrow depression ran beneath the pasture, almost perfectly straight. It disappeared beneath the flooded grass and continued toward the eastern field. Mara knew that line. She had seen it years ago. Her grandfather had driven the Ford 8N along it every spring. She had always thought it was an ordinary drainage ditch. But this ditch had been buried for decades. "How deep is the water?" Claire asked. Mara looked at the pecan tree. "About a foot here." "Then why is it moving underneath us?" Mara didn't answer. Ghost began walking. Mara followed. The buffalo wasn't rushing. He wasn't frightened. He simply moved from one patch of pasture to another, stopping every few yards. Each time he stopped, Mara found another cluster of crabs. The first group had been near the pecan grove. The next appeared beside an old fence post. Then another beside a collapsed irrigation pipe. Then another beside a shallow depression in the pasture. Claire began marking the locations in her notebook. After 10 minutes, she looked up. "They're forming a line." Mara nodded. "Exactly." Claire studied the flooded field. "That can't be random." "It isn't." Ghost continued east. Mara followed him through the shallow water. The crabs followed too. Not all of them, but enough. Hundreds moved slowly through the grass, their small shells appearing and disappearing beneath the surface. Mara stopped beside the old fence. The fence had been there longer than she had. Most of the posts were rotten. One remained solid. Her grandfather had painted it years ago. The paint had almost completely disappeared. Mara placed her hand against the post. Something was carved into the wood. She couldn't read it anymore, but she remembered where it had been. Her grandfather used to stand here during heavy rain. He would watch the pasture. Never the sky. Always the ground. Mara had once asked why. He had said, "Water tells you where the land is weakest." She hadn't understood. Now she did. Claire was looking toward the abandoned rice field. "That drainage line goes there." Mara nodded. Probably. We need the old map." They returned to the farmhouse. Mara left Ghost in the highest section of pasture with fresh hay and clean water. He was perfectly content. That mattered to her. She didn't want anyone thinking she was risking the animal for a mystery. The buffalo had shelter. He had food. He could move freely. But every few minutes, he turned toward the eastern field. Mara noticed. She went inside. The farmhouse smelled of wet wood and coffee. She opened the kitchen drawer where her grandfather had kept his notebooks. 3 notebooks. A broken pencil. 2 rusted bolts. And an envelope. Mara opened the first notebook. Planting records. Rainfall. Cattle weights. Fence repairs. She opened the second. Machinery. The Ford 8N. Fuel consumption. Hydraulic repairs. A note about replacing a worn belt. The third notebook was different. It contained maps. Mara spread the largest one across the table. Claire leaned over. The old farm appeared in faded pencil lines. The lower pasture. The pecan grove. The abandoned rice field. Then Mara saw it. A black line ran beneath the entire property. It began near the western pasture, passed beneath the barn, curved around the pecan grove, then continued toward the abandoned rice fields. Mara traced it with her finger. "This is it." Claire stared. "What?" "The channel." Claire shook her head. "That line doesn't exist on the parish drainage records." "It existed for my grandfather." "Then why isn't it documented?" Mara turned the map over. There was another drawing on the back. A cross-section. The old rice field wasn't simply a field. It had once been part of a much larger water management system. Mara read the notes silently, then stopped. "What?" Claire looked at her. Mara pointed to a sentence written beside the drawing. Her grandfather had warned that the underground channel should never be sealed completely. Claire frowned. "Why?" Mara looked toward the flooded pasture. "Because it carries water away from the lower ground." Claire's expression changed. "If that's true, the flood may have reversed the flow." Mara looked back at the map. The storm surge had pushed water inland. The old channels could now be carrying water in the opposite direction. That would explain the crabs. But it raised another question. Where is the water going? Claire followed the black line with her finger. The channel crossed beneath the farm, then entered the abandoned rice field. She looked up. "That field is surrounded by an old levee." Mara nodded. "And if the levee is holding all this water," Claire finished the thought, "the pressure could eventually come back through your property." Mara looked toward the window. The farmhouse was on higher ground. The lower pasture wasn't. Neither was the barn. Neither were the hay supplies. Mara folded the map. "We need to see the channel." Claire looked at her. "It's underwater." "I know." "Then how?" Mara walked toward the barn. The Ford 8N sat beneath the roof, mud still clinging to its tires. She ran her hand across the faded hood. Her grandfather had bought it used decades earlier. He had repaired it so many times that half the machine seemed to be held together by pieces from other farm equipment. Mara climbed onto the seat. The engine turned once, then twice. On the third attempt, it started. The old tractor settled into its familiar rhythm. Claire smiled. "You really trust that thing?" Mara looked at the flooded pasture. "I trust what it can do." She attached the old box scraper to the 3-point hitch. The implement was heavy, scarred, and crooked from years of work. Mara lowered it. The Ford rolled forward. Ghost watched from the higher pasture. As Mara approached the old fence line, he began walking toward her. Claire glanced at him. He's following us. Mara looked over her shoulder. He wants to see where the water goes. The tractor entered the shallow floodwater. Mud rolled beneath the tires. The scraper cut a narrow line through the wet soil. At first, nothing happened. Then the ground suddenly softened. The Ford lurched. Mara stopped. Water began flowing around the scraper. Claire stepped closer. Look. The water was moving east. Mara climbed down. She crouched beside the trench. Another crab appeared. Then another. Then dozens. They were moving directly along the new channel. Mara looked toward the abandoned rice field. Something was wrong there. The water level beyond the pecan trees had risen several inches since morning, and at the far end of the field, the old levee was beginning to bow. Mara stood slowly. Claire saw it too. How long before it breaks? Mara looked at the map, then at the levee, then at Ghost. The buffalo had stopped walking. His head was turned toward the eastern field. A deep vibration passed through the ground. The crabs suddenly changed direction. Mara's stomach tightened. They weren't moving toward the old channel anymore. They were moving away from it. And every one of them was heading toward the same place. The abandoned rice field. The crabs were moving faster now. Not because they were panicking. Because the water was changing. Mara stood beside the Ford 8N and watched hundreds of tiny shells travel across the flooded grass toward the abandoned rice field. Ghost followed them. His pace was steady. His head remained high. He wasn't frightened by the rising water. He was tracking it. Claire walked beside Mara. The flow changed. Mara nodded. Something opened. They reached the eastern field. The old levee looked worse than it had 20 minutes earlier. A long crack had appeared near its base. Water seeped through in thin streams. Mara crouched. The soil around the crack was wet and loose. Then she noticed something underneath the grass. A concrete structure. Only the top edge was visible. She brushed away the mud. A rectangular drainage box emerged. Claire stared at it. This wasn't on the county map. Mara looked toward the farmhouse. My grandfather knew. Claire shook her head. He didn't just know. She pointed at the concrete. He maintained it. Mara remembered the old tools hanging in the barn. The ones she had never understood. The long steel rod. The heavy wrench. The rusted gate handle. They weren't random. They belonged to this system. Mara stood. We need to open it. Claire looked at the cracked levee. Before that breaks. Mara ran toward the ford. She drove along the edge of the field until she found an old access road hidden beneath weeds. The road ended beside a rusted metal gate. The gate was nearly invisible beneath mud and vines. Mara climbed down. She pulled at the handle. Nothing. She tried again. Nothing. Dale Mercer arrived in a county truck. The 52-year-old inspector climbed out and looked at the levee. His face changed. You found it. Mara stared at him. You knew this was here? Dale hesitated. Your grandfather showed it to me years ago. Claire turned toward him. Why didn't you tell the parish? Dale looked at the old gate. Because we thought it was obsolete. Mara's voice remained quiet. And now? Dale looked at the water. Now I think he was right. Mara grabbed the heavy wrench. She struck the hinge. Once. Twice. The metal groaned. The gate shifted. Water rushed beneath it. The crabs immediately changed direction. They followed the moving water. Hundreds of them. The sight was extraordinary. They crossed the field in a living stream, moving toward the newly opened drainage passage. Ghost stood safely on the higher bank watching them. Mara looked at him. Then at the water. Then at the ford. She understood the sequence. The buffalo had noticed the underground movement first. The crabs had revealed its path. Her grandfather had built the system to use that natural movement. The farm didn't need to fight the flood. It needed to reconnect the land to its old drainage route. Mara climbed back into the tractor. She lowered the box scraper. The Ford 8N moved slowly along the edge of the old channel. The scraper opened a shallow trench. Water immediately followed. Mara continued. 10 feet. 20. 30. The engine strained. She eased the throttle. Her grandfather had taught her that too. Machines lasted longer when you stopped asking them to be stronger than the work. The trench reached the old drainage gate. Water poured through. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then the abandoned rice field began draining. The water level dropped. The crack in the levee stopped widening. Dale stared. "It's working." Mara didn't celebrate. She was watching the lower pasture. The water there was still rising. The old channel wasn't carrying enough yet. Mara drove farther. The Ford's tires sank into soft ground. Claire shouted from the bank. "That's enough." Mara stopped. The tractor remained steady. Then the earth beneath the rear wheels shifted. The machine tilted slightly. Mara immediately backed away. The ground was too soft. She climbed down. The Ford was safe. But she couldn't drive farther. Mara looked at the channel. Then at the buffalo. Ghost had walked closer. He stopped beside a patch of tall grass. He lowered his head. He pawed once. Mara approached. The buffalo moved aside. Beneath the grass was another opening. A narrow, natural channel. Mara knelt. Water was already moving through it. She followed it with her eyes. It connected directly to the trench she had just opened. She looked at Claire. "We don't need the tractor." Claire understood. The land already has the path. Mara cleared the grass by hand. Water began moving faster. Then the crabs appeared. One after another. They entered the channel and disappeared toward the rice field. The water followed. Within minutes, the lower pasture began to drain. The barn remained dry. The hay stayed above the waterline. The farmhouse was untouched. Dale walked toward Mara. "I owe your grandfather an apology." Mara looked at him. "He isn't here." "I know." Dale looked toward the old Ford. "But you are." For the first time that day, Mara smiled. Then a tremendous sound rolled across the field. Everyone turned. The old levee had finally opened. But instead of collapsing toward the farm, the water rushed through the restored drainage system. It split around the pecan grove. It followed the old channel. It moved east, away from Mara's fields. The crabs followed. Hundreds of them. The entire pasture seemed to come alive. Mara stood beside Ghost. The buffalo remained perfectly calm. His white coat glowed against the dark, wet grass. Claire walked toward them. "You know what the strange part is?" Mara looked at her. "We thought the buffalo was the thing we had to save." Claire looked at Ghost. "But he was showing us what needed saving." Mara placed her hand against the buffalo's neck. His skin was warm. His breathing was slow. He was healthy, safe, and completely unaware that 3 hours earlier, an entire county had assumed the flood would destroy the farm. Mara looked across the pasture. The water was leaving. The crabs were disappearing into the restored wetland. The pecan trees stood above the receding flood. The old Ford 8N sat quietly beside the trench. Nothing about the scene looked miraculous. It looked natural. That was what made it remarkable. Nature had been doing the work all along. Mara simply learned how to listen. Dale walked toward the county truck. Then stopped. He turned around. "Mara." She looked up. "What?" He pointed toward the eastern field. A final wave of crabs was crossing the pasture. Hundreds of them. But they weren't moving randomly. They were forming a perfect line along an old submerged channel. Mara followed the line with her eyes. It disappeared beneath the pecan grove. Then continued toward the farmhouse. Her expression changed. Claire noticed. "What is it?" Mara slowly looked toward the house. "There's another channel." The three of them stood silent. The flood was draining. The farm was safe. But beneath the farmhouse, something ancient was still carrying water. Mara stared at the farmhouse. For several seconds, nobody moved. The floodwater had fallen across most of the pasture, but a narrow stream still ran beneath the grass. It disappeared near the back porch. Claire walked closer. "You're sure?" Mara nodded. "My grandfather always kept that side of the yard clear." Dale looked at the map again. "The old channel runs beneath the house." Mara shook her head. "Not beneath the house." She pointed toward the pecan trees. "Beside it." They followed the water. The narrow stream curved around the farmhouse foundation and disappeared beneath an old wooden footbridge. Mara lifted a board. Water rushed beneath it. Then 3 crabs emerged from the mud. Claire smiled. "There they are again." Mara crouched. The water was clear now. She could see a shallow channel beneath the soil. It had been there all along. The flood had simply exposed it. Mara remembered her grandfather's words. "Some ground has a job you can't see." She finally understood. The farm wasn't built despite the water. It had been built around it. For generations, the land had collected rainfall, moved it through shallow channels, and released it toward the marsh. Modern drainage had gradually buried parts of that system. But the old paths had never disappeared. They had only become harder to see. Mara stood. "We should leave this open." Dale nodded. "I'll make sure the parish doesn't fill it." Claire looked at him. "You're changing your mind?" Dale gave a tired smile. "I'm changing the map." Mara walked back toward the pasture. Ghost was waiting beside the pecan grove. He had found the highest patch of grass and was calmly eating. Mara smiled. "You knew where to stand too." The buffalo lifted his head. For the first time that day, Mara laughed. Not loudly. Just enough for Claire to hear. The floodwater continued disappearing. By sunset, the lower pasture was mostly visible again. Mud covered everything. The fence needed repair. The hay shed would need new boards. The old drainage channel needed reinforcement. The bank payment still existed. Nothing had magically become easy. But the farm was standing. That mattered. The next morning, the parish engineers arrived. They expected to inspect flood damage. Instead, they found a functioning wetland system hidden beneath the farm. They measured the old channels. They checked the soil. They tested the water. Then they found something unexpected. The crabs were not random arrivals. They were coastal blue crabs carried inland by the storm's surge and moving through the old drainage network as the water returned toward the marsh. The old rice system had unintentionally preserved a connection between the farm and the surrounding wetlands. The flood had reopened it. Mara's grandfather had understood the principle without needing modern terminology. Water follows the easiest path. Life follows the water. The engineers recommended preserving the channel rather than sealing it. For the first time, Mara heard a county official say something that sounded almost like her grandfather. "Don't fight the land where it already knows what to do." The farm slowly recovered. Mara repaired the fences. She cleaned the barn. She replaced damaged boards on the hay shed. She kept the Ford 8N working. Its faded paint remained. So did the dents. She refused to repaint it. "It earned those," she told Claire. The albino buffalo remained healthy. He gained weight that winter. His coat became clean and bright again. The chipped horn never changed. Neither did his habit of stopping at the pecan grove whenever heavy rain approached. Mara started paying attention. She learned to watch the water. She learned where the soil stayed cool. She learned which grasses appeared first after rain. She learned how the crabs moved. And she learned that her grandfather hadn't left her a broken farm. He had left her a system she hadn't understood yet. 5 years later, the difference was obvious. The lower pasture had become a carefully managed wetland edge. The pecan trees were producing again. The restored drainage channels prevented standing water from destroying the fields. Mara was still farming. She had expanded slowly. No enormous loans. No reckless machinery purchases. Just one improvement at a time. Claire remained involved. She no longer arrived to tell Mara what the farm needed. She arrived to ask what Mara had noticed. That small change meant more than either woman ever said. The county inspector, Dale Mercer, became an unexpected ally. He helped secure funding to restore several old drainage systems throughout the parish. He always mentioned Mara when people asked where the idea came from. But Mara never claimed credit. She simply said, "My grandfather left the channel open." The story spread. People began visiting the farm during heavy seasonal rains. They wanted to see the old drainage system. They wanted to see the albino buffalo. And sometimes, if the conditions were right, they saw the crabs. Hundreds of them. They would emerge from the wet ground after coastal water moved inland. Then they would disappear again as the marsh reclaimed them. The buffalo became part of the farm's identity. Children called him Ghost. Mara called him Old Man. He was no longer the strange animal people had questioned. He was simply the biggest animal on the farm. And the calmest. 10 years after the flood, Mara stood beside the same pecan grove. She was 29 now. Her boots were still muddy. Her hands were still rough. The farmhouse had been repaired but not modernized beyond what the farm needed. The old Ford 8N still sat beneath the shed. Its engine had been rebuilt once. Its tires had been replaced twice. But the tractor remained unmistakably the same machine her grandfather had trusted. Mara looked toward the pasture. Ghost stood near the restored channel. Older now. Massive. Healthy. His white coat bright against the green grass. He lowered his head. Mara watched. Then she noticed movement near the water. One crab. Then another. Then dozens. She walked closer. Hundreds of tiny crabs were emerging from the wetland edge. They moved along the same ancient path. The same path her grandfather had drawn decades earlier. The same path Ghost had followed during the flood. Mara stood quietly. Claire arrived beside her. Neither woman spoke for a while. Finally Claire said, "Still listening?" Mara smiled. "Always." Across the field, Ghost turned toward them. Then he began walking. Mara walked too. The crabs continued toward the marsh. Behind them, the pecan trees moved gently in the morning breeze. The old drainage channel carried a thin ribbon of clear water. The farm was quiet. Not empty. Quiet. There was a difference. Mara stopped beside the old Ford 8N. She rested one hand on its faded hood. For a moment, she imagined her grandfather standing there. Not speaking. Just watching the field. Watching the water. Watching the animals. She understood now why he had never tried to control everything. Some things didn't need controlling. They needed observing. The buffalo had taught her that without saying a word. The crabs had shown her the route. The old channel had done the rest. Nature had never abandoned the farm. People had simply stopped listening to it. Mara turned toward the pasture. Ghost stood in the mist. The first sunlight touched his white coat. Beyond him, hundreds of crabs moved quietly through the wet grass toward the marsh. The old Ford waited beneath the shed. The pecan trees stood over the channel. And the farm, once nearly swallowed by floodwater, breathed peacefully beneath the morning sky. Some land doesn't need saving. It needs remembering. If your family ever had a farm, ranch, orchard, or old piece of land that seemed to have a language of its own, tell us about it. Maybe there was an old tractor nobody wanted to replace, a field your grandfather refused to plow, or an animal that seemed to notice things before everyone else. Those small details can carry an entire family's history. And sometimes, the strangest lesson isn't found in a book or a machine manual. It's waiting quietly in the land itself. Until the next story, keep looking closely at the places other people overlook.